So welcome, Chairman. Chris Nelson is currently chairman of the South Dakota Public Utilities Commission. He was appointed January 8th, 2011 by Governor Dennis Daugaard to fill a vacancy on the commission and was elected by the South Dakota voters in November 2012 to continue his service for the remaining 4 years of the term. He was then reelected to a full term in November 2016 and currently remains on the commission and has been chairman at various times throughout his tenure there. Prior to his experience on the commission, he was Secretary of State, and he is an expert on USF issues. He sits on the Federal State Joint Board on Universal Service Issues. That is a commission that both the federal commissioners, the FCC commissioners, as well as state commissioners can be a part of. And he's been the state chair of that Federal State Joint Board for a number of years. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really happy to have you, Chairman. If you'd like to say hello, and then we can get into our Q&A if you'd like.
Thank you, Angie. Pleased to be with you. Wish I was there in person, but our 40-day legislative session is ongoing, and wisdom says I need to be in our capital.
Well, and this is the benefits of having broadband and these technical capabilities, is that you can be back there at work and getting the things done and yet join us here in DC. So we're so happy that you're able to be with us. What we've heard a lot of discussion over the last several months about universal service reform and specifically on contribution reform. There's a long history of contribution reform at the FCC. We've seen the current proceeding. It's been open for almost a decade now. And back in 2014, the commission asked the Federal State Joint Board to give its advice on what should happen in contribution reform. I was hoping you could bring us up to date. What happened with that effort? What did the state commissioners think needed to happen with USF contribution reform?
Certainly, the FCC in 2014, saw the trend line as to what was happening with the contribution method or the contribution percentage going up, and with no reason for that to change. And so they asked the state federal state joint board to take a look at that and come back with a recommendation on how we might make that fund more sustainable over the long term. And from 2014 through 2016, the state members worked very collaboratively with our federal colleagues, looked at a lot of different options for how that methodology might change. And then we had a change at the FCC going into 2017, and that collaboration really kind of fell apart, and we just didn't have the engagement from the federal side following that change at the FCC. And so for a year or two, we had some attempts at outreach with our federal colleagues, but that really didn't go anywhere. And so ultimately the state members said, you know what? We've studied this, we've come to a conclusion, and we put together our response to that referral and our recommendation and sent that to the FCC, and mostly wanted to make that available to the public so folks would know the work that we've done and what we as the state members felt would be a good way to move forward with contribution methodology reform.
And that particular recommendation that you had for the FCC, what were your thoughts about that? What did the state commissioners think should be done to address USF reform?
Again, this was based on a lot of research that we had done in that 2014 to 2016 timeframe. And essentially, we recommended a hybrid methodology whereby residences would be assessed on a per connection basis, a connection for a phone line, a connection for an internet line. And we estimated that connection fee initially would be somewhere in the 60-cent range per month per connection. And then on the business side, we recommended that those revenues would be assessed, and that assessment would be somewhere in probably the 6% range, certainly far less than the percentage today. And that with that, it would garner the same amount of money as was being garnered under the current or the old regime. One of the other things that we wanted to make sure of is that there was a balance between businesses paying in and residences, and as part of our algorithm, we set that as a 50-50. Businesses would contribute 50%, residences 50%. So neither side was going to be adversely impacted by this change in methodology. We felt it was something that was fair and certainly something that was sustainable because we had expanded the base and determined that both on the residential side and the business side that we would begin assessing broadband internet access service.
When you mentioned the sustainability, what's driving the need for USF contribution reform? Is that the main reason, is that it needs to be sustainable? And why is that? What's happening today that would cause the need for reform?
Yeah, and let me begin by saying from a very rural state, South Dakota, I have seen firsthand how important the Universal Service Fund is to expanding broadband access into the rural parts of this state. And I know it's not just South Dakota, but it's across rural America. And without this fund, that simply wouldn't have happened the way that it would have. And so I understand why this fund needs to remain strong and go forward. But as we all know, that the revenues that are currently being assessed continue to decline month after month after month. And as those revenues decline, the percentage of USS fee that's assessed to those continues to go up. And, we knocked up to that 33, 34% recently. And I think in anybody's mind, a 33 or 34% fee or tax, if you will, is not an appropriate level to be assessing. And so we looked at something that would be more reasonable for everyone that was involved as a consumer.
So you had mentioned that part of the solution that the state members recommended was to look at connections, whether it's an internet connection or it's a voice connection, but then also potentially to look at revenues that enterprise or business companies are paying in. What's the perspective on the need for broadening the base? Like, why include broadband services with respect to the broadening of the base? What do you think that would help accomplish?
Well, certainly I think as everybody understands, broadening the base going into the internet access area is a lightning rod. And so it wasn't something that we did lightly, but we also understood that unless you broaden that base, it's going to be impossible to lower the percentage of assessment because the traditional revenues are continuing to decline. And so we had to look at something else in order to bring that number down and broadband internet access. And obviously that's the area where most of these dollars are being spent today, is on internet access, whether it be rolling out broadband to new locations in rural America or providing lifeline services or rural healthcare or schools and libraries. It's being spent on broadband. And so we felt comfortable saying that that side of the equation ought to be putting some dollars into the fund itself.
Yeah. So you mentioned also the need to ensure the sustainability. So some have suggested that with all this money coming from Congress in the infrastructure bill, as well as some of the assistance that's coming for broadband from some of the emergency bills, that we should take a better look at USF. And the commission now has a proceeding that's open for the future of USF. Any thoughts from the state member perspective on what needs to happen with respect to contribution reform? Are you still advocating for the FCC to move forward with contribution reform pending that inquiry?
So I can say that the state members have not met to discuss the pending inquiry. So I'm going to just speak personally about that. And certainly I think in order to ensure wise use of taxpayer dollars and Universal Service Fund dollars, taking a look at the program periodically makes absolute sense. And certainly we've got a large number of dollars coming into the broadband space that is going to also make a difference in getting broadband built out. But at the end of the day, those dollars are going to end. And whether or not broadband, when we finish the job of building out broadband remains to be seen. And so until we know that, we think that maintaining the viability of the Universal Service Fund is important so that that mechanism is in place once these other federal dollars are gone to make sure that we can continue doing what needs to be done and that these these companies that operate in high cost areas can remain viable in serving people across this country. And so to your last question about, do we still support the recommendation that we made back in 2019? I will say today we've got an entirely new board, state members on the board, different than what was there before. We have not broached that particular question as a board, but I myself, while I am certainly open to options, I am still comfortable with the recommendation that we put forward in 2019.
Well, to that end, some policymakers have suggested that the federal state joint board actually needs to finish the process and issue an order under the last request from the FCC for you all to make a recommendation. Any thoughts about that? Do you think that's necessary since the state commissioners sent the letter in with their recommendations?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up. And I will tell you, the state members in 2019, we were of that mentality. We wanted to finish the job that we had been given. But absent interaction with our federal colleagues, we couldn't finish that job the way that I think it probably should have been finished. And so really the only thing that we had left at that point was for the state members to say to the FCC and to the world, this is our best recommendation. This is what we can do. This is what we offer you. We have done our job. And I think that we did do our job and we did it well. Now, would we be willing to get back together with our federal colleagues, if they chose to? Absolutely. I mean, we're open to finding solutions. But I think from our perspective, we would say we finished the job that we were given.
Thank you. That's really helpful to know. So moving to what some of the states have been doing on their own USF reform. So many states have their own funds, right? And it may address different needs, from build needs to operational needs to certain types of programs within the state. But we've seen that state funds face some of the same challenges that the federal fund has faced, which is the base of revenues may be in decline because they haven't been updated to reflect the more modern broadband services that are now available and that the funds are being used to support. What are your observations about what the states are doing? Are they modernizing to the degree that you were talking about the state recommendations for the federal program?
They are, and I will say South Dakota doesn't have a state fund, so my comments are my observations from other states, but other states have had proceedings where they have gone away from the revenues-based approach and gone towards a connections-based approach on telephone service. I don't know of any states that have drifted over that line into assessing the broadband connections or broadband access, but certainly have moved away from revenues towards connections as being something that those individual states believe would be more sustainable for them. And, and I've not heard any negative feedback from that. So I think that they've been successful in those transitions.
That's helpful to know. So coming up, we're going to have a panel, and as included in that panel is Carol Maddie, who's an expert on USF reform. And she issued a report that was sponsored by INCOMPAS, Shelby, and NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association, and makes a recommendation of the 3 methodologies that have been under consideration a way forward with the federal USF fund, which is to expand the base to include broadband revenues. So that would be both consumers as well as business enterprise customers. So very close, similar to what the state commissioners have recommended. Any thoughts about the way forward for the FCC to look at that report, look at the state recommendation letter, and to take additional comment and move this proceeding along this year? What do you think about that?
Certainly, and obviously I've read and studied Carol's report. I think it was very well done. And the point that she makes that is really valid is that, whether it be the methodologies that she's laid out or that the state members laid out in 2019, these are things that can be done fairly rapidly. We can correct the immediate problem in the short term by adopting some of these particular changes. Obviously, Commissioner Carr has got a very different idea, kind of a big picture idea of a dramatic change in how it can be funded. And certainly I think that's worth looking at. But as we know, that's probably going to take congressional action, going to be a little bit longer term. And so I think there's a number of us that think we ought to do what we can in the short term while some of those other ideas are explored at the congressional level.
Yeah, I think there's a big movement afoot for the FCC to move forward based upon its current record and the recommendation that Carol has made. We've seen over 250 organizations sign on to that most recently and expect that that number is going to be increasing. So we really do appreciate you taking the time to help educate us more about the state perspective on federal USF reform. And sorry you couldn't be with us in person, but it was really great to be able to connect via broadband. So thank you so much, Chairman.
Thank you, Angie. I appreciate it.